Welcome. I know you have to turn to look at me, but that's a good thing because then the whole presentation you could spend looking at the right people. I'd like to welcome everybody here. We have a lot of people from West Hanover and a lot of people from Lower Paxton, and I think that's great because a lot of our histories crossed each other, and I would love to see more and more of these joint meetings like this. If anybody's interested, if you didn't already, we do have a sign-up sheet for our emails up on the table there, and so please do that because we like to alert people when what presentations and that we're doing. But before we start, let's do the pledge. Christy.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Excellent, thank you. Our evening tonight will be spent purely on the presentation, and we'll be starting that momentarily with John Hetrick and Bob Thomas doing the actual presentation. I'm anxious. I think this will be a great one. Afterwards, when they're done and they're taking questions, please hold off on your question until we get a microphone to you, because we do live stream this, and your voice won't pick up on the question. So that's all that I ask. So Bob, you set?
That and direct your questions to John.
There you go.
No, great crowd. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Bob Thomas. I'm with the Lower Paxton Historical Commission, and I'm thrilled to have with us Mr. John Hetrick, who is the president of the West Hanover Historical Society. And as you'll find, John is much more of an expert on this subject matter than I am. So we are going to co-present tonight. I promise we'll be done in less than 2 hours. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. Subject matter is the frontier forts of central Pennsylvania. So let me try to frame this for you. We're going back about 275 years. We were before we weren't even Pennsylvania as a state. We weren't even a country. We were a province of the British throne. The Penn family was selling, and that's in quotation marks, kind of a little joke, land grants to European settlers in Penn's woods. And what was happening was the settlers were pushing the native Indian tribes to the northwest. If you can imagine, Pennsylvania kind of starts in Philadelphia, okay? Everything's in Philadelphia. So what was happening was, as the people were coming over here to settle, they were pushing the Indian tribes to the northwest, okay? I mean, we're going so far back that we were actually part of Lancaster County at that time. So the wild frontier was right here, okay? You all came here tonight by horseback, okay? And what we've gathered to talk about tonight is, what are we going to do about the Indians attacking us, okay? This was a letter in one of the reference materials from John Harris in 1755. We expect the enemy upon us every day, and the inhabitants is abandoning their plantations, being greatly discouraged at the approach of such a number of cruel savages, and no sign of assistance. The Indians is cutting us off every day, and I had a certain account of about 1,500 Indians, beside French, being on their march against us and Virginia, and now close on our borders. Their scouts scalping our families on our frontiers daily. Andrew Montour and others at Shamokin desire me to take care that there was 40 Indians out many days and intended to burn my house and destroy myself and family. I have this day cut holes in my house and is determined to hold out to the last extremity, if I can get some men to stand by me, few of which I yet can at present, everyone being in fear of their own families being cut off every hour. Such is our situation. So that's kind of the backdrop of what we're dealing with. So how did we get there? Well, basically, there were a number of, say, questionable land purchases. To the Penn family's credit, It was their desire to purchase land in Pennsylvania, not just take it over by conquest, which was probably the normal way of the day. So they were purchasing land, and it started in Philadelphia and moved out. And what they were doing, they were forcing a number of Indian tribes, the Lenni Lenape, down Delaware Indians in Philly, the Conestogas in Lancaster, Shawnees. If you look at that map, you can see Delaware, Shawnee, Conestoga. There were a lot of Indian tribes. This map's from, I think, 1725. So as they were purchasing this land, there were a number of things. One of them was a 1737 walking purchase. Well, it was intended to be, one of the measurements the Indians used was how far could a man walk in a day and a half. So what I have found is that the Penn family found 3 fast walkers / runners, and they had 2 Indians that went with them. So they took off from the Delaware River and headed west, running. So they ended up with a much larger piece of land than what the Indians thought was going to happen. Some of these other things I've looked into, the Albany Conference, Susquehanna Land Company, there were 2 sets of tribes trying to sell the Wyoming Valley. The Mohawks were dealing with people out of Connecticut. The Penns were dealing with, I think, the Susquehannocks. So the concept of land ownership, I'm not sure was something, roaming tribes knew about. They lived where they could protect themselves, and then they'd move on. So this idea of owning land was kind of a British thing that came here. So there were a lot of discrepancies in what was agreed to, whether things were paid for, how far, what were the boundaries. You had different tribes selling the same land. A little bit confusing. But what was happening, especially in our area, in 1754, 1749, they were pushing up into our area, purchasing land. Also, at the same time, what we had going on was the French and Indian War, which started in 1754. Actually started out at Fort Necessity in Fayette County. And this was basically land disputes between the British and the French. So we were right in the middle of this. To our west, in Pittsburgh, there were many French forts. Duquesne, Necessity, Marchant, Le Boeuf up in Erie. The French had control of western Pennsylvania, the British eastern Pennsylvania. And here we sit right in the middle. So that kind of created somewhat of a boiling pot. In 1755, what's known as Braddock's defeat, the French soldiers and their Indian allies defeated the British, led by General Edward Braddock, at the Battle of Monongahela out in Pittsburgh. Okay, what was the ramifications of that? Well, there was a lot of momentum for the French. And more of the Indian tribes were aligning themselves with the French. And the French were exploiting this by supplying the Indian tribes and encouraging them to attack the settlers who were there from Britain, which was our settlers. So this would set the stage for a development of forts along the early frontier throughout Pennsylvania, basically to protect the citizens. That's what led to all this. It was pretty dangerous out here. Plowing a field, walking to church, being at your home, you could be attacked, kidnapped, scalped at any point in time. There were a number of local occurrences of Indian raids. There was the killing of James Mackey. The Mackey and Barnett young sons, were kidnapped. John and Isabel Craig were murdered in East Hanover. Andrew Berryhill was killed by Indians in Linglestown. So in October 1755, I found this quote: about the 20th, instant news was brought that the French and Indians had actually massacred and scalped a number of our inhabitants not far from Harris Ferry. So it was kind of a dangerous place to be out here. This continued. Of course, our provincial government was led by pacifist Quakers, Quakers aren't usually looking for a fight. So they were a little slow, but the people settling in here were Scotch and Irish people. So what it started to happen was many of the settlers started to take matters into their own hands. And they started to either fortify their homes or build a block house to protect themselves. So these are some of the names you've seen around our area, Barnett's Fort, Patton's Fort, Mackey's Fort, Fort Berryhill, Fort Gilchrist, Brown's Fort. These were all basically private homes that were fortified to protect their families. And if you were out traveling and being chased, you could get to one of these forts and be protected. Finally, in 1755, our provincial government, again, we're not a state yet, decided to establish a chain of frontier forts along the Blue Mountains and the Susquehanna River. And they were garrisoned with militia soldiers who would patrol back and forth. And this is where your Fort Lowther in Carlisle, Fort Hunter, Fort Swatara, Fort Manada, Fort Halifax, Fort Augusta, Fort Littleton. A lot of these are names you've seen signs and heard of. These were the provincial forts, and for the most part were, what do I want to say, stockaded, barricaded forts like that you would think of, with a big fence around them and all that. They were the provincial forts. So, John, why don't you take us from here for a while, and I'll be back in a little bit.
Thanks, Bob. All right, so as Bob said, my name's John Hetrick. For those of you that don't know me, I am from West Hanover, born there, lived there, but I did live, I ventured out, lived in Lower Paxton for about 5 years, so I still have my passport if you want me to prove it. But no, I just, real quick, I appreciate this opportunity here tonight. Bob called me an expert. He's going to make my head swell. I don't consider myself an expert. I'm someone who loves history. History is a hobby for me. I am not a professional historian, but I do love history, and particularly this topic. So, it's organizations like this, the Lower Paxton Historical Commission, the West Hanover Historical Society, where I'm from. We help to promote history and keep it alive, but especially all you people who are here tonight interested in this topic. It's great that you're out here. So thanks for helping us keep it alive, and I hope we have fun tonight. So, what's a frontier fort, right? It really depends on who you ask or what source you're using. If you talk to the Pennsylvania Historic Museum Commission, the people that put out those blue signs you see along the road, they might only consider maybe 3-4 forts in this area, right? You talk to somebody else, you read certain books, you might come up with 5 or 7. So why do we have that discrepancy? Well, it really depends, but what happened a lot is some of the forts were garrisoned by provincial troops, right? So what you would think of traditional soldiers and, with a fort with a stockade cannon. So if you look at that fort over that picture in the lower left, that's Fort Swatara. And that, the description that we have of that is what you would think of when you kind of hear a fort, right? It's got the stockade around it. And fun fact, this is why I love doing research on projects. For years, I interchanged stockade, palisade. I didn't know really what the difference was, but those sharpened, the logs that would be dug into the ground and sharpened that are around the fort, those are the palisades. When you put them all together and surround a fort or an area, that's a stockade. So little trivia. But anyway, so that is a fort in traditional sense, right? And that was garrisoned by the provincial government and militia. But then you have these other houses that were more what I would call maybe a place of refuge. As Bob touched on earlier, it took a little while for things to happen around here. The situation was pretty bleak. It was a war zone, right? And the settlers petitioned the government, but the government in Philadelphia, for a couple reasons we won't exactly get into, but they weren't really listening. They were pretty far removed in Philadelphia from the situation that was going on. They didn't fully grasp what was happening. Also, they were, there's a lot of Quaker influence, which, as Bob said, they're kind of pacifist. So anyway, took a little while to get some actual forts in this area. So a lot of the settlers took matters into their own hands. They fortified their homes, right? So some of them might have looked like the one in the lower right-hand corner. That it was a stone house. Most likely, whoever owned it probably boarded up the windows or stoned over the windows and just left some ports to shoot out. Some of them might have still looked like a traditional house. That picture in the center, that's actually Fort Crawford. It's called Fort Crawford in East Hanover, Dauphin County. It was never really a fort in the traditional sense. It was John Crawford's house. A little later on, I'll show you why it was kind of in the mix, but that probably always just looked more like a house. It was never really a fort. And sometimes, as things get written about over the years, we kind of, I don't want to say sensationalize, but, we add a little bit to the lore. So somewhere along the way, someone probably called that Fort Crawford, but it was really just, a house. But they're all still worth talking about. And for the purpose of this, we're going to consider, all those kind of locations forts. So the fort in the lower left, Fort Swatara, we're not going to get into tonight. I'm staying solely in Dauphin County, but that's in modern-day Lebanon County. The interesting thing about that fort, in which can also add to the confusion, that one actually started out as a private home. The settler in that area, Johann Peter Hetrick, is actually my fifth great grandfather. He built a fort around his homestead because he had to, out of necessity, right? And then later on, the provincial government came along and they were like, "Hey, this is a pretty nice fort you have here." So they just made it better. They improved it. They built a stockade around it. They had some kind of watch towers around the edge, that kind of thing. But that's why we get the discrepancies. Just wanted to throw that out there. If you've ever researched the topic yourself, you'll get some different answers, right? All right, so the other really important thing to take into consideration when you're talking about the frontier forts, but really any topic in history, right? What are your sources? Where are we getting this information from? It kind of makes sense, right? The sources that were close to the events, probably the most accurate, or at least maybe the least kind of polluted over time, right? So a lot of those period records that we have from the 1750s and 60s when the conflict was going on, they come from the Pennsylvania archives and not the Pennsylvania State Archives, which is confusing, and also, ironically, the Pennsylvania archives are contained in the Pennsylvania State Archives. But the Pennsylvania archives were a series of papers. I think it's something like 130 volumes, a lot of information. And it spans pretty much early Pennsylvania up until I think the early 1900s. But specifically for the French and Indian War period, the frontier forts, there's muster rolls of soldiers, there's journals from officers that served at these forts. But one of the greatest resources is correspondence, right? Actual letters written back and forth from prominent citizens of the area, people that were, enduring these attacks. In some cases, they were writing to the governor. They were writing to other members of the government, other kind of prominent individuals, Edward Shippen, if you've ever heard that name, and things like that. So we have all that correspondence from the period that really helps give us this information, and that's called the Pennsylvania Archives. But one of the later greatest resources, and this is what a lot of those blue markers along the road were based on. It's what really, if you start reading about the frontier forts, I would say 90% of what's out there base their information on this report. This report, I call it the report to shorten it up. You tend to give things a nice big title to make it sound important, right? So the report of the commission to locate the site of the frontier forts of Pennsylvania. If you hear me say the report tonight, that's what I'm talking about. We're going to be here forever if I use that title all night. So just real quick on that report, it was commissioned by the State Assembly in 1893, and it took a little bit to research. So the first volume was actually published in 1895, and that's our area. Everything we're talking about tonight, kind of like Dauphin County, East Hanover, West Hanover, Lower Paxton, and other parts of eastern PA, that's in the first volume. The second volume was 1896. That's more western PA, think like the Pittsburgh area, all that, going out that way. And then both of those volumes were reprinted as a second edition in 1916. Just FYI, if you ever come across them. The 1916 version has a couple minor corrections, some grammar, some clarifications, nothing earth-shattering, so it's pretty much the same as the early reports. Those are all freely available. You can find them in Library of Congress, a lot of other sources. So it's, at least I can't remember the exact page count, but I want to say volume 1 somewhere like 400 pages. So if you're bored one weekend, maybe download that, read it. But really, and some of the stuff I'm going to get into tonight, it might sound like I'm knocking this report. I want to make it very clear. I'm not knocking this report. This report is amazing. We would not know half of what we do if we did not have this report, and if we did not have the researchers in 1895. Well, let's say 1893 through 1895. Wrap your head around that. If we didn't have the research that was done back in that time period, we just wouldn't know a lot of the facts we're talking about tonight. But It's also not unthinkable that maybe they didn't make mistakes. Imagine yourself back in the 1890s with the resources you would have had at the time, right? There's no Google, no internet, no smartphone. You're going out trying to find places that had long since toppled over, interviewing people about stuff that happened before they were born, reading through correspondence from those Pennsylvania archives. They were written during a wartime, so the correspondence isn't always clear. You're trying to grasp what you're reading, so it's not unthinkable mistakes were made, but that report did a great job and really set the base for a lot of what we know about the frontier forts today. And another honorable mention, Nevin Moyer. So I'm sure some of you here know Nevin Moyer, but if you don't, Nevin Moyer was a Linglestown resident, World War I veteran, teacher, and absolute lover of history. I would consider him the area's really first official historian, right? We didn't have historical societies back in Nevin's era. He was the historian of the area, right? East Hanover, West Hanover, Lower Paxton. We have a lot of thanks to give to Nevin for all the stuff he collected and documented about our history. But specifically, this book, if you've never seen it, is Welcome Home Celebration book. A lot of great stuff in there. He published that in 1946. He gave descriptions on 24 locations in this area and Hanover townships. And a lot of sketches you're going to see tonight were in that book. The original or copies of are back there on the table, so I encourage you to go look at them. It's just really neat. Look at them after the presentation. All right, so the last source that when we're talking about it, and this one kind of flies under the radar for a lot of reasons. I think one, maybe it's just not as big as the report. It came out at a time where maybe people weren't so much paying attention to the forts, but in 1960, William Hunter of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission wrote this book called Forts on the Pennsylvania Frontier. And what he did in that book was attempted to correct some mistakes that he viewed happened in that 1895 report, more so in locating the forts and in some of their names. The sources he used were a lot of unpublished research from colleagues at the PHMC. And also, the most important thing that he used that gives his work a lot of credit is he used land records. He dug into deeds. He went way back to try to figure out who owned the land where these forts were and to try to figure out where they were. So I reference him a lot and the report. I make comparisons and contrast, but all three of those resources are really great. Just making you aware so you know kind of where we got what we're talking about. All right. So kind of where we left off, right? We're in a war zone. A defense is needed. This map's a really great map from 1818 of Dauphin County, and you can, if my laser pointer works, you can really clearly see why I love these maps. You can see these gaps, right? Right here in this map, it's called Smith's Gap. Later, it's called Heckert's Gap. We know it kind of today as Piketown. This is kind of where Mount Laurel Church is, if you remember that area. Here's Manada Gap. You can see the mighty Manada Creek flowing down through there. Over here is Indiantown Gap, and then to the far, far east, we have Soterra Gap. So a big part of where these forts ended up being placed was because of these gaps. As Bob talked about earlier, a lot of these raiding parties would come and sneak through these gaps. Like I said, if you put yourself in the time period, it's a war zone. We are at war. We'd equate today probably what we call guerrilla warfare. They didn't really have that term back then so much, but these raiding parties would come, sneak in, attack the inhabitants, that live down in here in Lower Paxton, West Hanover, East Hanover, and so forth. And so after a while, we realized we needed to have some protection to watch those gaps and kind of defend against those attacks. And it really, as Bob said earlier, we were in a proxy war, right? We call it the French and Indian War here in America, but it was overall part of the 7 Years' War in Europe. It was two of the biggest superpowers of the time, right? Britain and France. And over here in America, we were all kind of stuck in the middle. We were, subjects of the king at that point. We hadn't gotten to 1776 yet, but in the French aligned with the Indians. So we were really caught in this proxy war. The British settlers against the American Indians. Ultimately going back to the French and British. But so this map again, just kind of remember those gaps where you see highlighted in this map. So this is a sketch from the 1895 report. It's going to be a little hard to kind of read some stuff up there, but it does give a really good bird's eye view of what we're talking about. So here, just to give you an idea, this is the Susquehanna River right here. This is the Delaware. It's over in here somewhere. I can't really see. There we go. the line of forts went from the Susquehanna the whole way to the Delaware, all along the Blue Mountains here. So over here you have Fort Hunter, you have Harrisburg, Lower Paxton here. We have Fort Manada, Fort Swatara getting into Lebanon. All these little red dots that you can kind of see stretching way, way out in the east. They were all forts, and they were roughly aligned with the mountain. A little bit more of a zoomed-in view of that 1895 report sketch. So just one thing I wanted to highlight here. Again, it goes back to what I said earlier. Really, what is a frontier fort? In this, you'll see Fort Hunter, you'll see Manada, which we know, and Fort Swatara, and some of the other ones in Lebanon County that we're not really going to get into tonight and further east. But these were more the provincial forts. These were kind of the big forts. Even Fort Manada was always considered an outpost of Swatara. It was, I'll show you in a little later, but it kind of paled in size compared to Fort Swatara. But what you don't see is all the ones in between we're really going to talk about tonight. They were smaller forts, but they were, like I said, in some cases just homes, not actual forts in the traditional sense. But they were also important because what the people in these forts did when the government actually established the forts and garrisoned soldiers in them, those guys weren't just hanging around in the fort all day, right, waiting for something to happen. They were going out trying to provide protection. How they did that, they ranged. If you ever heard, the Paxton Rangers, we're in Lower Paxton Township, Paxton Rangers, that's where those names came from. The people stationed in these forts ranged. So Fort Hunter, you would range to the east. Fort Manada, you would range to the west. And there'd be some kind of other stuff in between that you could take a rest at, water your horse, seek refuge if you needed to, but they never really rode further than they could get back in a day's ride. So in other words, they always made sure they could kind of get back before nightfall, back to their fort, back to their station, but they were constantly patrolling and ranging all day between those main forts. In the same way, Fort Swatara, they would, range this way, Manatee range, so they kind of split up the troops and go their separate ways ranging and patrolling. Here's another sketch from that report. Just wanted to show you really for the forts I'm going to talk about here in a second. We're going to start east to west, right? So we're going to start in East Hanover, Dauphin County, move to West Hanover, Dauphin County, and end in Lower Paxton and talk about one or two that are a little north of us, Fort Hunter and some of those. But this sketch shows, I recognize a little hard to see, but here's Fort Manada right here. This would be kind of in the gap, Manada Gap. And then there's some other forts it references that I'm going to get to in the presentation in a minute. I'm not going to name purposely right now. I don't want to confuse you, but you can kind of see where in proximity to Fort Swatara, Fort Manada was. They were pretty close. That's why this was kind of considered an outpost of Swatara. All right, so East Hanover, Dauphin County. If we take into account all those sources I talked about earlier, mainly the report and the book from William Hunter in 1960, I'm saying there's about 5 forts in East Hanover. So roughly we're going to work north to south. We're going to go slightly east, but up here north in the gap, I call this the Manada Gap Mill Site. There was a fort there. The report calls that Fort Robinson. I'll explain a little later in the presentation. That's probably an error. But Fort Manada proper was not in the gap. If you think about it, you wouldn't necessarily want your main fort if you're when these provincial forts were made by the government, right? They had soldiers, guys that came out and knew a little bit about tactics and warfare. You wouldn't want to put your fort right in the gap where your enemy's coming through. You put it down a little lower so you have a vantage point. You have a little space between you and those raiding parties. You have some time to react. So Fort Manada was just actually south of the gap. Over here to the east, and actually, you know what? Let me start. I should give you a little lay of the land. This is Manada Golf Course here, just to, if anyone's ever been there golfing. Let me move my pointer. Kind of roughly in this area is exit 77, Sheets, Perkins, to give you a little familiar with that. Penn National Casino, Race Course, that's all right up here. So we have like Penn National, Casino, Golf Course, exit 77, Perkins, kind of down in this area, just to orient you where we're at. But getting back to this, so they're both the report from 1895 and that later book I talked about, both agreed there was a fort here. They called it different things. What I think it is, and I agree with the later research, that book from 1960, this was Philip Robinson's house that was kind of a private fort. The report called it Fort Brown, and I'll explain why that conclusion probably happened here in a little bit. But sorry, we have 3 so far. We have the Manada Gap Mill Site, Fort Manada, Philip Robinson's house over here by the golf course. We're going to go slightly south, still in the east. This is Fort Crawford. Again, that was really nothing more than a house. That was John Crawford's house. And then we go a little bit west and further south, we have the Manada Hill Mill site. So again, this is very close. Probably hard for you to see. This is Sheets. Literally right here is the Sheets over by exit 77, Old Jonestown Road, Route 39. Manada Hill Mill is not far from there. There's still a mill on that site. It was rebuilt, remodeled in the 70s. Not the mill that would have been there back in the 1750s, but there is still a mill on that site. So that's kind of where we're at in East Hanover Township. Let's just take a deeper dive into that a little bit. So again, these sketches are awesome. Nevin Moyer had these commissioned. I always wondered what artist they came from. And the great thing, Bob showed me one of these sketches that he has, the originals, has the artist name, which I think is really cool. But these are done off of descriptions that we had from the forts from that 1895 report and probably some research that Nevin had done himself. So here's a sketch of that fort in Manada Gap. Now, again, the report calls that Fort Robinson, so why do we have that discrepancy? I'll get to in a second. But if you look, all these forts we're going to talk about, whether they were private or one of those provincial ones, they all had big timbers, right? They were log structures, big thick timbers, stone foundations. This one didn't have any windows; it just had portholes cut in to shoot muskets out, that kind of thing. All right, so why do we have this difference? Basically, in a nutshell. The report said that there was no doubt there was a Fort Robinson based on the correspondence from the Pennsylvania archives I talked about. There was mention of a Fort Robinson in the Manada Gap area in East Hanover Township, and the researcher of that report placed it at the mill site at Manada Gap. He went out there, interviewed the mill owner, was told this mill was an old Indian fort. He got this great story, and everything just seemed to line up. But unfortunately, what he either didn't have at the time or didn't use was land records. A little bit later on in 1960, William Hunter uses land records, and he figures out, that's probably not right. So why did that guy from 1895 get confused? Again, long story we're not going to get into tonight, but there's another really interesting gentleman, if you're interested in history, Colonel Timothy Green. He owned both mills, the one at Manada Gap and the one at Manada Hill at one time or another. He was also associated to that Robinson family of the Fort Robinson fame by having married into it. So we think the confusion probably came from that. But either way, there was definitely a fort there at the Manada Gap Mill site. We don't know who at the time, what name would have been associated with it, but it probably wasn't Fort Robinson. So just to give you a little zoom in of where we're at, this is 443, so this would be your kind of come in. You'd be kind of coming from the east out by like Penn National and coming up this way north to go around the mountain back to Fish Creek Valley. Here's Manada Bottom Road. You would take this to go kind of west out towards maybe exit 77, Sheets, all that. But this is the rare property for anyone who's ever been out there. It's been in their family for generations. This a lot of history there. Again, I love to go down history rabbit holes and tangents. We're going to be here all night. But this building, this tavern itself has a lot of history. The fort I'm talking about was actually right over here. So if you drive up here even today, you can't really tell from this aerial, but there's like a little garage shed thing kind of here. The fort would have been just a little bit below that. I'm going to show you another picture here from the 70s. So this was the mill. It burnt down, I want to say in the late 90s. Now, this was not the mill that would have been the fort. Even in 1895, when they did that report, the owner then told them that the mill had been rebuilt at least 2 times on that site. So even in 1970, this was not the fort, but everything we have points to this is probably the foundation of the fort. They kept rebuilding it, the mill, on the same foundation. So this is very likely the foundation where that Manada Gap mill fort was. And it's a little hard to see in this newspaper clipping, but that little garage shed I told you that you can still see today if you drive by is right there in the background. So if you go by that way, you still see this today. All right, that brings us to Fort Manada. So Fort Manada was more, like I said, it would have been a proper fort. When you think of a fort, it's got the stockade around it. These were called block houses. It looks like a block, but it's made of thick timbers, log. There would have been kind of I'm not sure if this is illustrating a spring house or like a powder magazine where they would have kept ammunition and stuff, but it's an outbuilding to the fort. So that's the artist rendering of Fort Manada. Now, the report, here, I'll get to this in a second. Both the report and that later 1960 book agreed that Fort Manada existed. They both agreed on the location, too, not in disagreement there. Where it differs is the report thought Fort Manada and Fort Brown were two separate places. And if you read the report, the researcher, Henry Richards, I can't imagine how he did what he did at that time, but he basically relates he had a really hard time finding the supposed Brown's Fort that he read about in the correspondence, so much so that at one point he thought it didn't exist. He was convinced it didn't exist. And then just when he had about given up, somebody shows him another old fort in East Hanover Township that they remembered as being an Indian fort, and they started asking around, and they found another older gentleman that remembered it. So at that point in that report, having known there was a Brown's Fort, not knowing where it was at, having been shown a location, he, process of elimination, this has got to be it. So the report named this other fort that he saw as Brown's. What we found out, what William Hunter established later in 1960 using land records, that Fort Manada and Fort Brown were actually probably the same place. And there's a couple key pieces of information that ties that together. One, there's correspondence saying that a James Brown who lived in the fort was killed at Fort Manada. But two, after James Brown was killed, there's a relative of his that applied for an application for a land transfer, for lack of better words. And it was the land that Fort Manada sat on. So that really ties James Brown, his house, Fort Manada, kind of all being the same place, in one and the same. Now, where was this today, right? I showed you some kind of historic sketches. So this is also from 1895. And here's Manada Gap. Here's this mill we were just looking at up in here. Here's Manada Gap Road coming down, north to south. And in 1895, the report sketched out where the site of Manada Fort. I know it's hard to see, but there's a little house. Here, let me use my laser pointer. There's a little house here and a little barn here. And the researcher in 1895 did a really good job of sketching them out. And at that point, he could also kind of see where the site of Manada Fort was, so he did a good job of putting that in relation to them. We don't have enough time tonight. You're going to have to trust me. Based on a lot of research, this is that house and barn from that 1895 sketch. It's still there today. You can drive there today. They're both still there. They still stay. So if you go a little east of there, of where we're going off that 1895 sketch, Fort Manada was roughly in this area. Here's Manada Gap Road. Here's 443 Mountain Road where they intersect. You go up here, you would be at that mill site I showed you a little while ago. It was off in here. Today, that's Indiantown Gap property. I wouldn't probably go trespassing on there, but that's where it was located. All right. Philip Robinson's house. This is the report called this Fort Brown, which I gave some explanation to you a little bit ago, but I'll reiterate here in a second. This fort, the descriptions about it said it had stone walls 3 feet thick. So Philip Robinson must have built himself a heck of a stone house with very thick walls. Now, I don't know if he actually would have had these musket holes or if there were windows here. Likely, he probably had windows that he boarded up. Again, keep in mind, this is an artist rendering based on descriptions we have, but the cool thing is I have some pictures here of the ruins of this fort. So here are the stone ruins of these stone walls from that artist sketch. This picture was taken sometime in the early 1900s. We don't know an exact date. It's labeled as Brown's Fort based off at the time that the knowledge they had from that 1895 report. But this was most likely actually Philip Robinson's house, not Brown's Fort. But these are the walls from that fort. Where is that fort? So if you've ever been to Manada Golf Club, it was right about here where these pine trees are in this parking lot. Here's 443. If you're going down this way, you're traveling east towards Hollywood Casino, Penn National. And it was pretty much right about where that copse of trees is. Now, the discrepancy on this one, right? So the report identified it as Brown's Fort, and I kind of told you why. Really, even in the report, the researcher said he just couldn't find Brown's Fort. He was shown the ruins, presumably in 1895, those ruins still had to be there. He was shown those ruins and assumed it was at Brown's Fort that he couldn't find. But William Hunter's later research using land records showed that there was never a Brown tied to that property. It was actually at that point in time during the French and Indian War, it would have been Philip Robinson. It was his house. And the Philip Robinson's house is mentioned in the correspondence I was talking about, that there was a soldier that had stopped there on his way back between Manada Fort and Fort Swatara. So it is mentioned. We just, we didn't exactly know where it was at until Mr. Hunter's research. So the funny thing, these signs, right? These signs are great, but two things you got to keep in mind about the historical markers. They're not always placed where something was, and sometimes they could be a little wrong. In this case, the sign says Fort Manada, which is, actually down the road a bit. But it does get it right that it says it was James Brown's log house fort named Fort Manada, but it wasn't there in Manada. It wasn't at the golf club. It was down the road a little bit further west. All right, Fort Crawford, a.k.a. John Crawford's house, another sketch from Nevin Moyer, great sketch. I'm sure this must have been a beautiful house back in its day. There's a great description of it, and as you can see, the artist did a really good job based on that description. But this wasn't so much as a fort. It was a place of refuge. It was somewhere where neighbors could go and hide if there were attacks. They could kind of maybe hide out during attack. It also, if you remember from the map I showed you a little while ago, it was positioned pretty nicely in between the forts in Manada Gap to the north, that one in the south at Manada Hill, and the others to the east. So it was kind of a good waypoint if someone maybe needed to stop for a little while. And that's kind of how it got associated with all these other forts. So here it is located. If you're familiar with East Hanover, the East Hanover Township building is kind of down here, so it's very close to the East Hanover Municipal Building. Here's I-81, but that's where the fort was located. Historically, it was the Rhodes Farm up to about the 70s, and I think it's been the Shutt family for a while after that. Still is, I believe. So this was a bill of sale I found for that farm when it was still the Rhodes Farm. It was sold in 78. Really interesting special mention, underground fruit and vegetable storage area, which in early days was used as a retreat from Indians. Right, Manada Hill Mill. So the report from 1895 does not mention this at all, but it does mention Fort Robinson. So I'll get into that in a second, but this is actually a really beautiful mill. If you've ever driven down Old Jonestown Road coming from, let's say, like exit 77, Sheets, Perkins, if you're going east into East Hanover Township, you drive by this, it'll be on your right. It was restored in the 70s, so this picture is right after it was restored. This is, again, not the original mill that would have been there in the 1750s, but it was restored by, I believe, the Deckert family in the 1970s, and it was modeled after a mill, I want to say, somewhere in Lancaster County. But so that's still, it's still standing today, a beautiful mill. And just to, again, orient you a little bit, you can kind of see here better. Over here is like exit 77, Sheets, all that. You go down here, here's the Manada Hill Mill. All right, so again, why do we have the different names, right? William Hunter used the land deeds, which is really, to me, gives him a lot of credit on naming these forts and figuring out where stuff was. He was able to trace back in 1960, using deeds and land records and whatever else he had at his disposal, that as of 1743, Samuel Robinson owned the land where that Manada Hill Mill was, in Manada Hill. Now here's where things get murky, right? At some point, Samuel's son Thomas inherited that property. It may have been after Samuel passed away. I didn't dig that far into, but at some point Thomas was given the property. Unfortunately, a little while later, Thomas died, and his widow remarried Colonel Timothy Green, who also owned the mill at that time period up in Manada Gap. And so that's kind of the most likely cause of the confusion between the two mills, and which was Fort Robinson. But based on land records, it definitely seems that the Manada Hill Mill was where Fort Robinson was. And in East Hanover, I talked about Fort Manada being kind of the garrison one, the provincial, with troops. At one point, Fort Robinson was for a little bit too. They had troops there. Not sure why. Maybe things got really bad. They had to have two, but in East Hanover, that was really the only two that ever had actual troops in. The rest were just private homes. All right, we made it to West Hanover. Thanks for sticking with me. Barnett's Fort. West Hanover does not have as many forts as East Hanover. We have 2 that are documented. There's a third that I suspect, which I'll talk about. But out of those 3, let's say, Barnett is the most famous, right? A lot of you have probably either driven past this sign, seen this side, or kind of heard about the story. But this side is along Linglestown Road. That's not exactly where the fort was. I'll show you what it was in a minute. But this site's pretty famous for something really tragic that happened there, and it underlines what was going on in that time period and why we needed these forts. So where we're at here, Piketown Road is here. The new Central Dauphin will be kind of just off screen down here. So if you're going up Piketown Road, you go across. This is Route 39, Linglestown Road. You go across there. You're coming up north. You hang a left onto Pheasant. After Pheasant, you're going to hit the Fox Hill Road intersection, and there's a little kind of farmhouse and barn still here. That's where Fort Barnett was. Here's a picture of, I believe, the east side of the fort. This is a picture you'll see everywhere on the internet. You'll see it at the Dauphin County Historical Society. It's a great picture of Fort Barnett. There's another picture I'm going to show you in a minute that really helps tie where Fort Barnett was that is not as well known. In fact, I've only ever seen the one copy of it that we have. It was built around the 1730s. It was Joseph Barnett's house, and then somewhere around the 1750s when the French and Indian War started, we think he fortified it and started using it as a refuge for for the settlers, for his neighbors. There's a really famous thing that happened here. Like I said, it underscores why things were so desperate. It's not that these settlers were going out and trying to hunt down the Native Americans or find war with them. It was, they were actively being attacked. The attacks were deliberate, and they were effective. They were striking fear into the settlers. The goal was to get them out of the area, right? The French really, at the end of the day, wanted to take over this British-controlled land, so they were trying to scare people away any means necessary. And the attacks were effective, and they unfortunately were also very gruesome. It was a really treacherous time to live in this area. But this particular incident, there was an attack. Mr. Barnett was wounded in the arm. I think he was also knocked out, if I remember. He might have been, when he got hit, I believe he fell off his horse, hit his head, and got knocked out. Mr. Mackey was killed. His neighbor, James Mackey, was killed. Both their sons were kidnapped. They were taken by the raiding party and just gone. Years and years later, Mr. Barnett, I don't remember exactly how it was discovered that his son was in Western PA, but his son was located in Western PA. He went with about a group of 500 men to go back to get his son. There was a whole group of soldiers, and to try to put this in perspective, at this point, his son had more or less been raised he was living with an Indian tribe out in Western PA. They had kind of thought of him as their own, and likewise, he thought of that, who he was living with, as his parents. So when Mr. Barnett went out to retrieve his son, it wasn't a kind of like run up and hug each other reunion. It was a little rough. The son didn't actually want to come back. He wanted to stay there, and it took a little bit. He eventually did come back with Mr. Barnett, but it wasn't it wasn't a kind of hallmark reunion, let's put it. But another interesting fact, though, some of these events were used to inspire. There's a Pennsylvania author, native Pennsylvania, Conrad Richter. He wrote a book called The Light in the Forest, and it kind of very similar to that story. And then that was made into a Walt Disney movie, the same name, I think in the late 60s. So if you've never read the book or seen the movie, it's worth it. So here's the other picture I was talking about. You saw the east side of Barnett's Fort. This is the west side of Barnett's Fort. What might not be easy to see on this screen because it's white and washed out is the farmhouse that still stands there today. And the fort was just behind the farmhouse. You can actually see there's 2 chimneys, 2 little windows there, chimneys up here. I know it's a little washed out on the screen, but so here's that same house. And the fort would have been a little, kind of on the back side of over in here. There's some members of our historical society years ago kind of placing a marker where the fort stood. You can just see one of those 2 little windows that we saw in that much older picture from the early 1900s. And then the Mackey house is just down the road, right? So Barnett's up here, Mackey's a little bit further down the road. This wasn't necessarily a fort per se. It was probably, again, just a fortified home of James Mackey. By all accounts, most of the neighborhood probably went to Barnett's if they needed to seek some refuge. But as you can see, that's a little bit of a distance away. So the Mackey house is a really cool house. a member of our historical society owned it up until just a year or two ago, and she sold it to another family who's taking great care of it. But her and her family took great care of it. I've been inside it. There's still a lot of period correct things, doors, mantles, huge stone chimney, fireplace. It's a wonderful example of preserved living history. Here's a picture from the 40s of the house. You can see, now today you don't see it. It's, I can't remember if it's stucco or what's on the outside, but here the old logs are uncovered, right? You can see it was a log cabin, real thick timbers there. So there's a famous story, and I've seen the door. It's still there. The door's still there. You can't really see it as much today. It's been painted over a lot, so the paint tends to fill in this hole. But there's a famous story of the door at that house with the tomahawk marks in it, allegedly from that attack where Mr. Mackey died. But either way, the same door is still on that house today. The hole's not quite as visible. It's also, to the best of my knowledge, I think the only structure in West Hanover that's part of the Historic American Building Survey, the HABs. So we have, some great documentation on it, which is always good for these historic buildings. And then the other documented fort in West Hanover, let me just see where I'm at on time. Okay, it's Fort Stewart. So Fort Stewart, again, was more of a house than a fort. And there is a house still there that was part of that property. Here's the new Central Dauphin High School, right? So this is north. If you're traveling south down Piketown Road, you'd eventually hit 22 down here somewhere. But this is Fort Stewart. There's a really kind of older looking house that still stands here. That was not the fort that was around back then, but it's part of the property. There's a big wrought iron B on the side of the house. If you ever drive by it, that's what I'm talking about. But there you go. You can kind of see the house. You're driving north to south, and the house is on your left. And there's an artist rendering of Fort Stewart. It likely was a block house that was built by the homeowner at the time as a place of refuge. So this letter I'm going to read kind of quickly. But the great Nevin Moyer wrote this to the, I believe, the new owner of the house, but that was in 1948. So, but anyways, he wrote this letter to the owner of that property. And this is an original letter someone donated to us. We have in the archives of the West Hanover Historical Society. My wife helped me transcribe it. Nevin had great writing, but it's, if you've ever tried to read older cursive, sometimes it's hard to make out. So I have the transcribed version. Luckily, it's a lot easier to read. It says, Nevin Moyer, Linglestown, PA, November 22nd, 1948. My dear sir, perhaps I am a stranger to you, and also you are a stranger to me. I am a teacher and have been for more than 50 years. I also soldiered a long time. I am a native of these parts. 4 parents were early settlers. All my life I have been interested in the preservation of our history, and for that reason only I am writing you. You have purchased historical ground taken up by the Stuarts about 200 years ago. They owned the place up until about 1885. A little to the northeast of the brick house, say 40 feet, stood Fort Stewart. It was 2 stories. It was torn down about 1898. You might find some interesting things in the soil on this spot, in the garden, even on the farm, in the form of money, buttons, colonial belt buckles, bullets, arrows, flintlock stones, parts of guns, stirrups, etc. The barn in particular, and the barn is actually not there anymore, but the foundation kind of is. The barn in particular on the west end is one of the oldest around, built before the Revolution. Take notice your stable door hinges. And I don't know, I'm going to try to highlight it. He actually drew a little drawing of the hinges, but sorry. Take notice your stable door hinges are of the date, the arrow type. I felt I should write to tell you about these things and your purchase to help you be more proud of it. A Stuart girl was captured by the Indians during the French and Indian War there and taken off. In 1946, the Legion put out a 125-page book, size of a phone book, with 150 historic pictures in it. One is of Fort Stewart. It tells about our early settlers, fort, etc. We printed 1,200 copies. Now 50 remain. They sell at my door for $1.50. That's a bargain if you ask me. But I'll send you one if you'd enjoy. He goes on to say, if you want to ask me questions about your historic Fort Stewart farm, I will be glad to try and answer them. The Stewarts sold out to a Major Anthony who carried a bullet in his lungs from the Civil War. When the Anthonys moved away, they left a locked room with the rarest of trophies. Some tenant broke into the room and all objects disappeared. I will be glad to meet you sometime. Yours very truly, Nevin W. Moyer. So that's Fort Stewart. Again, in West Hanover, I think we know documented two. There was Fort Barnett, Fort Stewart. I think there was a third. If you look at the mountain gaps, Heckert's Gap is pretty prominent. This is a drawing from a book by another local author, Oscar Stroll. Now, the drawing is a little off in some ways, so I don't exactly, how should I say this? I've been meaning to do more research into this, but this author has a Fort McClure highlighted here right under what says Heckert's Gap. I've never heard that name. I've never come across it in documentation, so that's something that I want to look into more. But I also don't know if this map's a little off, because right here where it says Fort Manada, it says Beaver Creek. Beaver Creek would actually kind of be over here. This is Manada Creek. But either way, it gives me some pause to think, we had a fort at all these gaps along the mountains. We know that from other documentation. There probably would have had to been something here in Heckert's Gap, Piketown, West Hanover. We just don't have any documentation. It's probably been lost to history, unfortunately. And over here is Fort Patton, which you guys will hear about in just a little bit. All right. Hopefully I didn't put anybody to sleep. We're going to give it back to Bob. Thank you.
All right, fasten your seatbelts. We're going to move fast. We're going to get into the Linglestown area. Fort Berry Hill. This is the farm that was in the past known as the Running Pump Tavern. Christy and Eric lived there. So on the east end of Linglestown, right at the bend in the road. And the site of Fort Berry Hill, and again, this was a fortified home, would have been right there at the bottom where the big stacks of hay bales are today. And the other thing we know historically is that Andrew Berryhill was killed by the Indians on the hillside behind his home. So I put a dot kind of up there on the hill where we think he was killed. And there's some belief, Eric, I think, that he's buried under one of them piles of hay bales. So anyway, this was another drawing of it. I think the left side might have been the oldest part of this building, and it was eventually became known as the Running Pump Tavern. Now, here's an old picture of that farm. I grew up knowing this as the Eyster Farm. The farmhouse is gone, the barn's gone, but the Running Pump Tavern stood on this property. And I think this picture, Eric's probably 1900s maybe. Yep, something like that. So that was the tavern. Now, just take a quick mental note. In the front of the farmhouse, there's a big wall of stones right here. Just keep that in mind for a second. Here's an 1895 picture we found. It's pretty beat up. I mean, it's fallen down. It's ready to be torn down. But this thing had a 4-hearth fireplace in it, huge fireplace. The folklore, I believe, Eric, is that these stones were the stones that ended up out along the road, which collected many of a Linglestown resident over the years. But those supposedly were the stones that ended out along the road. Now, you've all seen this sign over by Patton Road on the west side of Linglestown, Patton's Fort. And again, it tells the story of what we've been talking about tonight. It was a station of the Paxton Rangers, defended the gaps in Homestead, blah, blah, blah. We have a Nevin Moyer sketch, again, of this building. The sketch makes it appear to be a stone building. So, again, a heavily fortified. On the left side, you can see the little slot windows, which is typically what was used to shoot out of and not be shot at. Right near that is Fort Gilchrist. This building still stands there. It's slowly deteriorating. It may fall down, I don't know. But the Gilchrist family were large landowners in the area, and this fortified home, I'm personally not sure which part of the building is the original, if any. The foundation may be. We've had people in there. It's old. But I can't stand here to tell you with any certainty that is exactly the fort. But that's where it was. Here's a 1920 picture of that building. And on the back of this picture, I don't know if Nevin Moyer wrote this or what, but it said the second story on the west end was raised 3 logs by Simon Harper in 1851. That name struck a bell with me because that was the farm where I live now on Parkway East, Simon Harper. And that John Goodaway, our local Indian, lived here and died. And, we've talked about John Goodaway in the past, was supposedly a friendly Indian, and we think he's buried somewhere near where the First National Bank is. Anyway, or was. Now here's a picture from 1942 where they took the porch roof off, and I have this picture back here on the table, but it exposed the heavy timbers, which kind of matched the story about it, the second floor being raised 3 timbers. It's heavy timber. So let's do a little jaunt up the river here. We had to protect the river as well. So we're getting out of Lower Paxton, and you all know about Fort Hunter. You've probably heard about Fort Halifax. Maybe you've heard about Fort Augusta up in Sunbury. These were provincial forts. Okay, these are not homes. These were provincial forts. And the river had to be guarded because that was the travel method back then, either on boat or foot. Fort Hunter, I think you've probably all been there. The mansion that there is not the fort, but it sits on where the fort was. And there's a historical marker there, and it tells a story much like we've been hearing all night. A stockaded blockhouse, protect the frontier, was a supply base in building Fort Augusta. Abandoned and fell into ruins after 1763. We'll repeat that theory a little later. But that's where it was. Now if we go up to Halifax, I think you've all know where Halifax is. On Route 47 north of Halifax, heading up to Millersburg, is where Fort Halifax stood. Again, this was a provincial fort built in 1756. It served as a go-between fort. Now, they're trying to build a fort in Sunbury. So this was kind of a stationing fort. We go at Fort Hunter, we can gather materials, men, all that. We needed to get them part way up there, so they built another fort, Fort Halifax. So it was kind of a go-between fort, if you will. And actually, it recently, I don't know, Jay, in the last 5-10 years, it was archaeology done by Juniata College, and I think they have found where it was located there in the field. Is that right? Yeah. 3 years ago. Excuse me. Found this old map. It titled it the Fort at Armstrong's. That's Armstrong Creek, I think, coming into the Susquehanna there. What's interesting, it kind of gives us a description of what it might have looked like, that 4-pronged fort thing. And there's a historical marker there along the road explaining when it was built, and it was a chain of frontier forts to protect the settlers. So if we keep going north, we get up to Sunbury. This is where Fort Augusta. This was, from what I can tell, was a major fort. It was strategically located right where the branches of the Susquehanna come together. And it was the northernmost provincial fort that I'm aware of on the Susquehanna. Again, found an old map, and it's got that 4-pronged fort design as well. And there's also a marker there indicating, when it was built, 1756. I've actually found a painting, a drawing. I don't know the date on this, but looks good. But it kind of gives you a real good visual of what these fortified forts might have looked like, and it's kind of interesting. There's a stockaded fence around here. These are timbers, those pointed, what'd you call them, John? Palisades. So I guess if you got through the door here, you had to get past these things, and then of course the fort had a big log fence around it. But it seems to match the drawing on the map, so it looked good. I thought I'd use it. There aren't a lot of pictures from 1750, so. Actually, what I found out, there's actually a little replica fort built up there in Sunbury. that kind of, again, actually shows you what it might have looked at. I don't know what scale it's at, but, you were housing a lot of men and horses, so you needed some buildings. But there's actually a replica that you can go up there and take a look at. Those pointy palisades look a little dangerous, so. So let's just finish up. Let's head a little bit west just to get you a couple things here. There was a fort in Carlisle, and we mentioned earlier, it was the first provincial fort. And there were two forts out west, Fort Littleton and Fort Loudon. There's a marker in downtown Carlisle that tells the story of the Carlisle Fort, the first fort authorized by Pennsylvania. So I'm assuming that's correct. But it was later called Fort Lowther. There's a Lowther Street over there. But it kind of sets the tone. Carlisle's had military bases forever, and this was kind of the beginning. I mean, where the Carlisle barracks are eventually became, I think, a Revolutionary War barracks. In fact, there's an old magazine building still there, I think. So anyway, the Carlisle Fort is, you all know where Carlisle is. So let's just take a little trip. And this was, I should have known this, and I've been driving past these places all my life, but you start west on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, you get through the first two mountains, and kind of in the valleys, and there's exit 189, Willow Hill. But it's Fort Loudon. So if you didn't know, you'd think, it must be a military base here somewhere, Fort Loudon. No, it was a provincial frontier fort. And it's set on Route 30 in Franklin County, a little south of the Turnpike. There's actually a marker along Route 30 that tells you it was built 1756, provincial government. You've all heard of the Forbes Road, going west. Route 30 was the way to go west back then. So that, it was garrisoned, and I found it interesting that by 1765, the colonials were starting to kick the British out of it. So, one of the things I found interesting putting this together, we start out, we're part of the British, fighting the French, and then later when we want to kick the British out, we align with the French, So it all goes around, comes around, I guess. Again, if you're headed out the Turnpike, you get through the third mountain tunnel, and exit 180 is called Fort Littleton. I never knew what that meant until I started putting this together. Fort Littleton was actually spelled differently. Again, 1755, named by Governor Morris after Sir George Littleton, then the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Anybody have any idea what that is? I looked it up. It's kind of like the Secretary of the Treasury. So the Secretary of the Treasury of the Province of Pennsylvania is what it was named after. And I guess the name got a little Americanized over time, but you drive right by these things and you don't realize what the history is. So that's pretty much the forts. John mentioned, the 1895-96 report is a great resource. I want to thank Bill Minsker. He dug out the actual original 1942 pencil drawings. I have them back here on the table if you want to take a look at them. Don't touch them because it says do not rub drawings. But what was interesting, the Fort Patton drawing is the only one in the one bottom left-hand corner, and it says, it identifies the artist, drawn by, I think it says, Hepford Miller Printing. That doesn't mean anything to me, but at least I wanted to give somebody credit for doing these drawings. But if you want to take pictures of the originals, they're back here. So that brings us to the conclusion. I don't know if you have any questions for John or I, or anything to add, or.
I can add one for the Fort Halifax was only in use for about a year, but it was regarded as a rowdy, undisciplined fort. They had mutinies, drunkenness, and I believe one soldier was actually sentenced to be hanged. I don't know if they hanged him there, or they may have taken him to another fort, but it was a rough
Rowdy
place. And it
bunch.
wasn't only used.
Be careful, I got relatives up there.
Yeah. One of the reasons they discovered its use fell apart was there was, in the Susquehanna River, between the fort and the other bank of the river, there was an island. And the fort was kind of useless if the Indians could sneak around downstream behind the island or upstream behind the island. And it lasted about a year.
Yeah. Yeah, everything that I do in this research, it seems about at the end of the French and Indian War, these forts all seemed to just start to fall apart. They weren't used. They went into ruins. People probably took the timbers. So they all kind of start to disappear around 1763, 64. So, anybody have anything else? Yes?
First of all, thank you very much, both of you, for
Oh,
a very interesting
welcome.
presentation. Yep. So I'm just trying to get a sense, like how many, white colonials, of English descent were living in this area. I mean, I imagine it was very sparsely populated. And then a second related question, I do get the sense, looking at these pictures, the forts look very small and primitive, but I do get the sense from your presentation that they, for the most part, did their job and they were military effective. So I wanted you to comment on whether they fulfilled their mission.
From what I can tell, they did, and I think they were built, as John was showing, they didn't have a lot of windows, and they had little ports. The other thing that was interesting, you think Indian attacks, you think bow and arrows, that kind of stuff. They had guns, okay? They had guns, muskets. So this wasn't just hand-to-hand combat. For example, when Joseph Barnett, him and Mackey were ambushed, they shot Barnett in the arm. He drops his musket. The Indians pick up Barnett's musket. I read this in an article. I don't know if it's true. They used Barnett's gun to kill Mackey, and then kidnapped their two boys. Killed him right in front of the boys, and Barnett was able to get away and survived. But and I'm sure they took their guns in with them, and I've got to suspect the French were supplying them with guns. So it wasn't the old bow and arrow F troop kind of thing. They actually had guns. So. But I think the forts did their job as far as I could tell. I mean, we continue to develop the area and people continue to move out here. But I think they, like you said, they were meant to just, you're either going to die or you're going to get in this building. Once you got in the building, they didn't seem to be able to get you. But, Christy.
Yeah, quick question. John had mentioned, hi John, that the Barnett boy returned home. What happened to Mackey's son? That was never mentioned.
Yeah, so for whatever reason, Mackey's son doesn't get talked about as much. I guess maybe because it's just not as great of a story. It actually is a really interesting story, but the Barnett, dad went to rescue the son, but it's just so the Mackey boy, I can't remember exactly how, if he escaped on his own or if he was traded off. Somehow he got away from the captors, ends up joining the British Army, travels the world, spends years away. The Revolutionary War breaks out. He gets back to America fighting for the British. He goes AWOL, abandons, and goes and finds his mother, and then they move away to Maryland, I believe, later. Yeah, it's a great story in itself, but it never gets talked about. Yeah.
Yeah, and as John mentioned earlier, I've read articles where the Barnett boy, I think he was only maybe 8 or something when he was captured. So he spends like 8 or 9 years living with an Indian tribe out in western PA. And he was given to an Indian family who had lost a son. So he was raised as an Indian. One thing I read was part of their return or release was part of the treaty ending the French and Indian War, the return of captured citizens. And I think the Barnett boy, when he knew what was going on. They were bringing him to the fort in Carlisle. And somewhere in that travels, he escapes. He doesn't want to go back because he thinks his family's been totally killed. And he's been raised by this Indian family, and that's his family. And it was only, I think, at some point he finally sees his father and realizes who it is. And then, then you had that hallmark moment. But yeah, he initially, evidently, as a probably 17, 18-year-old kid, did not want to come back because he didn't think there was anything to come back to, and he had been acclimated into the Indian tribe, and that was his family. So, Yes, Dave.
First off, again, thank you very much. If anybody's interested, as soon as you go out those doors, on the right-hand side, we have 3 showcases. And in the middle showcase, I have a magazine from the 1700s. And it was very difficult for me to read because it's the Old English. But it was amazing how it referred to communications with Philadelphia, and it said, well, we came across a wagon of, but they were just dead Irishmen, so it was really no big loss. And a lot of that comes, I think, from why you didn't have the protections, because they weren't people of quote unquote importance.
Right.
And I speak as an Irishman saying
There you
that.
go. Now, I've seen some information, letters kind of reading to the effect, someone out here writing to Philadelphia and in a nutshell saying, you're all fat and happy, eating your cheese and drinking your wine, and we're out here getting our heads cut off. And when are you going to do something about it? You've sold us land to settle out here. When are you going to help us out? And then they finally started with the provincial forts, and the rest is history.
I have a question.
Yes.
Maybe John can answer because it was in his presentation. But all the pictures you show was the forts were on the south side of the Blue Mountain Ridge. Was that like a boundary line for the Indians, or why weren't we on the north side where they're coming from?
Yeah, so, there's some exceptions, right? But I think Bob talked about it early in the presentation. PA was kind of settled southeast to northwest. So we were really on the cusp of that frontier. Once you got over that first mountain, that was still kind of wilderness, frontier, no man's land. The majority of the settlements were on the south side of First Mountain. And it not to say there wasn't, some scattered back in there, maybe, here and there, but the majority of them were on that south side. So that's why all the forts were down there. Yeah.
Jay, I know you'll know about this, but I read an article, I think it was a 1918 article about the Barnett boy being kidnapped. And the first night after they kidnapped those kids, they spent that night at McGilligutty's Rock, which later became a granite quarry up in Piketown, if some of you know where the old quarry was on the other side of the mountain in Piketown, which wasn't that far, but I guess when you're on foot or horseback in the dark, it was far enough the Indians felt they could stop there and spend the night, which was just over the mountain, But anybody have any other questions? Well, if not, thank you all for coming out. Hope you really enjoyed it.
All right. As we're coming to an end here, we won't have any presentations in December or January. We'll be using those for business and planning. So we're hoping, depending on the weather, early in February, March, we'll be back to our presentations. And one of the first ones we'll be doing is the Charlton Church and the Brown School. So hopefully you can be here. Again, thank you all for coming. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
Make a motion to adjourn.
Second? All in favor? Thank you. Take care.
Quick comment. Over here on the table by the wall, some of you would know the elementary school teacher in the Central Often District by the name of Phyllis Mangle. She had a collection of Central Dauphin, Lower Paxton yearbooks, which are over here on display that will become part of our collection. There are 22 yearbooks starting from 1924 up to 1950. And they'll join our collection. If you're interested, look through those because they won't be out on display normally.